All right. So, Boker Tov, gentlemen, this maracha in the Otzar Ayunim is 11 pages long, and you could literally spend hours on each page. I spent a lot of time going through the first 4 pages of this major piece, and Mirza Hashem will try to highlight the insights here into this this first section that would take us months to learn. The issue here is about Tenai in both Nazirus and in Nedarim, because the Gemara establishes in Ksubas on Daf Ayin Dalid that Kol Milsa de Lesa B'Shlichus Lesa B'Tenai. The entire parsha of Tanaim is derived from Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain in the Gemara Kiddushin, and we're restricted in Hilchas Tanaim to the paradigm, if you will, of Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain. And there, we were talking about being Yoresh and being Kona, a Chelik in Eretz Yisrael. There's Shlichus in Kinyanim, and therefore, the Gemara says that since we derive Tenai from Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain, and in Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain we talk about Kinyanim, so just like Kinyanim lend themselves to Shlichus, then anything that lends itself to Shlichus can lend itself to Tenai. But if there's no Shlichus, then there's no Tenai. And this leads us to a Gemara in Masechet Nazir on Daf Yud Aleph. And the Gemara establishes that there is a Tenai with regard to Nazirus. A person can accept Nazirus ala Tenai. And Tosas immediately asks the following question. Since we have a principle called Milsa, the Lesa B'Shlichus, Lesa B'Tenai, clearly, Tosas says, there's no Shlichus in Nazirus. And if there's no Shlichus in Nazirus, there should be no Tenai. How can Nazirus lend itself to Tenai? That's Tosas' kasha. Adaf Yud Aleph Amid Beis. Why does Tosas assume that there's no Shlichus in Nazirus? He doesn't spell it out. But let's just say it this way. Shlichus is a mitzvah shebegufa. You know, it's like, I have to be makabel the Nazirus, I have to fulfill the Nazirus. I can't send a proxy to fulfill something that I need to fulfill with my goof. I mean, on a simple level, we could compare it to, let's say, putting on tefillin, or a talis, or sitting in the sukkah. I can't send you as a shliach. It'd be interesting to imagine shlichus for all Taryag mitzvahs. I could sit here and do nothing and fulfill all my mitzvahs through a shliach. And the same thing should apply to Nazirus. Now, Tosas says, if there's no shlichus in Nazirus, I can't appoint you as my agent for Kiyum HaNazirus and not for Kabbalas HaNazirus, then by definition, I can't make a Tenai in Nazirus. And yet the Gemara assumes on Daf Yud Aleph that there is a Tenai in Nazirus. Now, to understand the answer of Tosfos, we have to break down Nazirus into 2 parts. One part of Nazirus are the Isurim that are generated by Nazirus, which are threefold: the Isur Yayin, the Isur Tiglachas, and the Isur Tumas Mes. However, the flip side is what we call Siyum HaNazirus, or termination of Nazirus. And there we require karbanos, so 3 karbanos, 3 behemos. And Tosas says that within the context of Nazirus, we have karbanos, and karbanos lend themselves to shlichus. And since the carbon dimension of Nazirus has shlichus to it, therefore there's Tenai in Nazirus. So again, just to go over it one more time, there's a little bit of a chadgadya here. Number 1, we have karbanos of Nazirus. Number 2, karbanos lend themselves to shlichus. Number 3, therefore, since Nazirus, at least in part, can be fulfilled through a shliach, therefore, hence, you can have a Tenai in Nazirus, because kol milsa de isa b'shlichus, isa b'Tenai.
Is the Karbono really the Iker of Nazirus, though?
Karbanos.
Karbono is not the Iker of Nazirus.
So, Eli, this is the objection that everyone raises to Tosfos. While it's true that within the greater context of Nazirus, there is at the end of the Nazirus, when you terminate, a chiyuv karbanos, but that's not what Kabbalah's Nazirus is all about. Kabbalas Nazirus means accepting upon yourself the Isurei Nazir, the Nihuge Nazir. But to say that Karbanos, so the Achronim derive from this Tosfos a very far-reaching conclusion that essential to Kabbalas Nazirus is Kabbalas Karbanos, that when I accept upon myself Nazirus, the Karbanos that I will bring at the termination of my Nazirus are part and parcel of the Kabbalas HaNazirus.
Yeah, the examples in the first Mishnah, the Masechet, of ways being to accept Nazirus through Yad is saying like Harei Alai, the Korban. That's how it makes a person to a Nazir.
So that would seem to support Tosfos.
This idea that somehow
Karbanos is not just a Chovas Nazir b'siyum mashal Nazirus, but it's part and parcel of the Kabbalah, and therefore accepting upon yourself Karbanos Nazirus might be a Yad l'Nazirus.
We also had that in the introduction shir. We were talking about the Chefza Gavra. I don't remember the details of it, but there was something that because the Chiyuv of Karbanos was in the Chefza, so therefore you could use either Lashon, and I would pull in the second part.
Yeah. Okay, great.
So,
Now, what we want to do today is we want to examine another, or not even one other, but many other possible answers to explain why there's Tenai and Nazirus. So we're going to sort of put Tosfos on the side and move on. Number two, Roman numeral number 2, is the Shita Mekubetzes. He says the following, and you'll see this on page Tzadi if you have the copy here. And again, I always want to thank Howie for doing that tircha of sending it out. On the left side of the bottom of page Tzadi, he says the following. We have the following principle. Principle number 1 is Asi Dibur Umevatel Dibur. Principle number 2 is Lo Asi Dibur Umevatel Maisa. Now, based on this set of principles, we can establish the following: that the Torah had to be Machadesh, the Parsha of Tenai, because Lo Asi Dibur Umevatel Maisa. So, for example, a man gives a get to his wife, and then he makes a Tenai. The Tenai is Dibur, and that doesn't have the power to be Mevatel the Maisa Gerushin, or the Maisa Kiddushin, or the Maisa Kinyan. Therefore, we need to come on to a new Chiddush in the Parsha B'nai Gad B'nai Ruven of Tenai. Because logically, based on the principles of halacha, we would not validate a Tenai. You don't have the power through Dibur to be Mevatel a Maisa. However, says the Shita Mekubetzes, in the case of Nazirus, we're talking about a dibur. And if we're talking about a dibur, then I don't need the parsha of B'nai Gad B'nai Ruven to be Mechadish Tenai. Tenai will operate irrelevant, regardless of the Tenai B'nai Gad B'nai Ruven, simply because Asi dibur umevatel dibur. So when he makes a Tenai, and he says, if this doesn't happen, then the original dibur of Kabbalas Nazirus is batel, then his Tenai has the power of dibur that can be mevatel dibur.
Why do we assume that people can do mevatel dibur?
So this is a sugya Masechet Kiddushin called dibur mevatel dibur. It has to do with understanding hafrashas trumas u'maisrus, because the Gemara says that trumas u'maisrus is isa b'machshava. So if I look at the trumas u'maisrus and I decide that I want to be mafresh this chelek, even without a maisa of hafrasha, it's chal. And the Gemara says over there that if he adds another dibur that would be mavatal, the original afrosha, then asi dibur mavatal dibur. Then the Gemara at the end actually backtracks from that and says that no, the dibur of afrosha in Truma is considered a maisa. But we'll get to that in a minute. So given these principles, which again is, this is a sugya unto itself of asi dibur, mavatal dibur, and so forth and so on, therefore, excuse me, the Shita Mekubetzes comes to the conclusion that we don't need the parsha of B'nai Gad B'nai Ruven of Tnoim within the context of Nazirus, because Asi Dibur Umevatel Dibur. And therefore, even though, regardless of the fact that there's no shlichus in what? In Nazirus, not like Tosfos, who says that the shlichus in karbanos and Nazirus. Nevertheless, I can still justify Tenai and Nazirus. I don't need to come on to Isa b'shlichus, Isa b'Tenai, because Isa b'shlichus, Isa b'Tenai is a principle that's derived from the parasha B'nai Gad B'nai Ruven. But in Nazirus, I can operate regardless or irrelevant to the parasha B'nai Gad B'nai Ruven. And the reason for that is because Nazirus is a dibur, and Asi dibur, umevatel dibur.
So the Shita is basically saying, as opposed to, I suppose classically the Rav always explained that the phrase of that Kodam She'eino b'shlichus eino b'Tenai, is that it has to do with control,
Right,
and they're fundamentally connected. But the Shita is saying no, it's almost coincidentally. It's just like Tenai Kafel, just a
the Shita is working with what I would call a very technical approach. He's defining all Maisa Kinyonim as a Maisa. Therefore, Dibur cannot be Mavatal and Naisa. So we have to come on to the parasha and the Chiddush of B'nai Gad and B'nai Ruven. And here in Nazirus, technically we're talking about a Dibur, and therefore he can be Mavatal that Dibur through a Tenai, and we don't need to come on to the Chiddush of the parasha of B'nai Gad and B'nai Ruven. Do you follow? It's a very kind of mechanical structure. But the Achronim point out that there's a tremendous advantage to the Shita over Tosfos. Why? Tosfos is claiming that the reason why you can make a Tenai in Nazirus is because you can send a Shliach for the Karbanos of Nazirus. That's not going to answer another question. Why is there Tenai in Nedarim? We're going to see sugyas all over the place in Shas that you can make a Tenai in a Neder. A Neder does not lend itself to Shlichus at all. There's no Karbanos in a Neder. So a person says, Konam Kikar Zel Lai, he can make a Tenai, as we'll soon see, and yet there's no Shlichus in Karbanos here because there's no Karban in Kikar Zu Alai. But if we take the approach of the Shita Mekubetzes, then Nedarim like Nazirus is what? Dibur. And if there's Dibur, then you could be Vatal Dibur. And that would mean that in the halachas of Nedarim, you could make a Tenai despite the fact that a Neder and its fulfillment could not be achieved through Shlichus. Now, believe it or not, and this is really Ripley's, one of these amazing kind of things, there is a Shita that says that you can appoint a Shliach in Nedarim. I can ask you to take a Neder on my behalf. Okay, that's going to be the famous Shita of the Trumas Hadeshen. The Trumas Hadeshen lived about 6 centuries ago. So he's like, that borderline period between the Rishonim and the Achronim. So all the Achronim attack the Trumas Hadeshen because they say the following. They say that, how can you tell me that there's Shlichus in Nedarim? If you want to see this inside, it's on page Tzadi Aleph, in the third paragraph from the top, Vehine b'noda b'Yehuda. You have that? Shemo ila shlichus b'nedarim, and he quotes the Trumas Hadeshen. So the Noda b'Yehuda asks the following question. He says, Tosfos says that there's no shlichus in Nazirus. If there's no shlichus in Nazirus, at least in the Kash of Tosfos, right before Tosfos introduces the Karbanos of a Nazir, then there should be no shlichus in Nedarim. So that the Noda b'Yehuda is really rejecting the Trumas Hadeshen based on our Tosfos here in Nazirus, because Tosfos is assuming that there's no shlichus in Nazirus. If there's no shlichus in Nazirus, then ipso facto there should be no shlichus in Nedarim. How could the Trumas Hadeshen postulate that there's shlichus in Nedarim? He also, interesting, quotes of Beis Yosef at the end of this paragraph with regard to Bittul Chometz. Now, Bittul Chometz, according to many Rishonim, is mitam hefker, and hefker is chal midin neder, and therefore, says the Beis Yosef, you cannot appoint a shliach to be mevatel your chometz for you. So again, another chadgadya. Again, let's go through it again. The Beis Yosef is saying, number one, Bittul is mitam hefker. Number two, hefker is built on Nedarim. And therefore, number three, since there's no shlichus in Nedarim, there's no shlichus in Bittul Chometz. But obviously, the Beis Yosef is assuming, which is the assumption of the Noda b'Yehuda as well, that there's no shlichus in Nedarim. And that makes sense because Tosfos says, if not for Karbanos, there's no shlichus in Nazirus. And therefore, why should we make any distinction between Nedarim and Nazirus.
According to Tosos, how can you have it Tenai in the Nedarim?
Correct. That's what we're stuck with now. Because if we don't accept the Trumas Hadeshin, and we're rejecting the Trumas Hadeshin because we're assuming that Ma Nazirus ein lo shlichus af Nedarim ein lo shlichus. So if we work with that premise, then there cannot be Tenai in Nedarim. And Tosa's answer to defend the validity of Tanaim in Nazirus is not going to hold water for Nedarim. Now, I'm going to fast forward for a moment to the Meshech Chochmah or the Or Sameach. If you take a look on the left column, about 7 lines down from the top. Who would believe that anyone could defend the Trumas Hadeshin and at the same time differentiate between Nazirus and Nedarim? Only someone as great as Rabbi Simcha could take that on. It's a real chutzpah neder. And he says the following, that number one, a neder, which is a konam, means konam is a yad for korban, and you're saying that this kikar is also alike ki konam, which means ki korban. And in order to bolster his opinion here about an equation between nedarim and karbanos, not only through the halach of hatfasa b'karban, but also yesh me'ila b'konamos. Now, if a person violates a hegdesh and he misappropriates hegdesh for his own purposes, he's chayav me'ila. He's stolen something from hegdesh. And if a person takes upon himself a konam, kikar zu alai, and then he enjoys the benefit of the konam, not only has he violated bal yachal dvaro, but he has also violated me'ila. Why? Yesh me'ila b'konamos. Apparently, when we're matfis a korban onto a kikar through konamos, through nedarim, we generate a status of hegdesh in the kikar. It's like being magdish the kikar. Otherwise, how would you violate the Isa Me'ila by benefiting from the kikar? And that means that in the context of an equation between hegdesh and nedarim, we can establish that there is shlichus in nedarim. I can appoint you as my shliach to take a neder on my behalf. How could that be? Just like I can appoint a shliach to be magdish, a behema, or whatever object on my behalf, so too I can appoint a shliach to take a neder on my behalf. Why? Because a neder equals hegdesh. Because yesh milah b'konamos.
You use that to say why there's Tenai, or you even takes it.
Well, yeah, we're going to go
out to
right. We're going to go one step further. Once we accomplish our goal that there's shlichus in nedarim, then the whole kasha falls away. We said, how could there be Tenai in nedarim? Because kol milsa less of a shlichus, less of a Tenai. But here there is shlichus in nedarim. I can appoint you as my shliach to accept on my behalf a neder.
You know, what he's quoting here, he's saying that since neder is so similar to hekdesh, and since by hekdesh Tenai works, here also Tenai would work. Does he also say that shlichus would work?
Yeah, I think he's talking about
neder?
both shlichus and Tenai, if I'm not mistaken. Take a look at it. Yeah.
Pretty clear.
I'll tell you this, Rabbosai. You know what's fascinating to me? Yeah. What's fascinating to me is that hegdesh is really a hakna. It's a kind of a kinyan, and that's why there's me'ila behegdesh. And as hegdesh is a monetary ownership. In the case of the Nedarim, it doesn't seem to be intuitively logical that neder is a hakna. Neder is an isur haflas peh with an isur bal yachal tvaro. Maybe it's an isur chefta, but I wouldn't say that the isur chefta is something similar to hakna. I mean, I'm not being makna this, but on the other hand, Rabbi Simcha is building himself on that shita, which again requires a lot of study of yesh me'ila b'konamos. So if that be the case, it could be that Tosfos never even raised the question of how could Tenai work in Nedarim. He was only bothered by Tenai and Nazirus, because the Nazirus doesn't have an Iser Konam and an Iser Hegdesh, and therefore it certainly clearly doesn't lend itself to Shlichus in the Havamin of Tosfos until he adds Karbanos, and therefore Tosfos was bothered by Tenai and Nazirus. He never even entertained the question, according to Rabbi Simcha, of why Tenai is valid in Nedarim. That was positive, because Nedarim, like Konamos, like Me'ila b'Konamos, is Hegdesh, and therefore there is Shlichus in Nedarim. And again, this is all to defend the Trumas Hadeshet, who took that, step into the wild blue yonder, and he said there is shlichus in Nedarim. And the whole kasha, well, why didn't Tosas ask the kasha in Nedarim? The Tosas kasha would be as difficult in Nedarim, even more difficult, because at least in Nazirus he could get away with shlichus as far as karbanos. You can't pull that rabbit out of your hat with regard to Nedarim. And now we're going to say no. We're going to take a whole 180-degree turnaround. We're going to say, let's accept the Trumas Hadeshet, and let's assume that Tosas never asked the kasha about Tenai and Nedarim, because he knew very well that Nedarim lends itself to shlichus, based on the Meir Simcha's explanation, the equation to Hegel.
Meir Simcha is applying it even to regular Nedarim, meaning there's only Me'ila by Konamos, not by regular.
Right. I guess he's saying the following, that every neder is chal through hatfasa, even if you didn't make a hatfasa lehedja, but it works through yad. In other words, the assumption is I'm being matfis every neder in a carbon.
So a neder is kind of like a koname without the Isser Me'ila. I'm only being partially.
Again, yesh mila b'konamos means that you have to bring a carbon me'ila because you violated an Isser Me'ila.
A regular neder that's not a koname.
Again, I would say a regular ned that's not a konam is a konam, because of the halacha.
But without the Mila.
Again, this should bring us back to the first Ran in Masechet Nedarim, whether every neder has to be chal through atfasa, and if you don't have atfasa, then it's only chal midin yad. Many Rishonim disagree with that. But in any event, at least Rameir Simcha would argue that within the broader context of Nedarim, there is such a thing as what? As shlichus. Okay, fine. Now, what we skipped here is a base mayor. So you might go back to the right column and see the base mayor. And he says that according to Rishonim, now again, he's not willing to upgrade the Trumas Hadeshet to the status of a Rishon. So right now, he's assuming that the Trumas Hadeshet is an Achron. But the Rishonim agree that there's no shlichus in neder. I can't appoint you as a shliach to accept upon me on my behalf a neder because it's a davar shebegufo and it doesn't lend itself to shlichus. And that's what he says. That the Torah says that you have to observe your neder. Why? Kechol yotze mipiv yasa, and yotze mipiv is a davar shebegufo and doesn't lend itself to shlichus. Now, Reb Shmuel, the Rosh Hashiva of Panovich, he wants to explain that there's a difference between Nedarim on the one hand and Nazirus on the other. And this would give us another perspective on why the Trumas Hadeshet would validate Shlichus in Nedarim. And he says the following. Shlichus applies when I create a chalos. If I create a chalos, Kiddushin, Gerushin, Kinyanim, that lends itself to shlichus. I can ask you to be, shall I say, my boy koach, my representative, to create that chalos. He says the following. Herein lies the distinction between Nedarim and Nazirus. In Nedarim, you are creating a chalos. In Shvuah, you are creating a chalos, whether it's an Isa Gavra or it's an Isa Chefza. In both cases, you have created a chalos. And if you're creating a chalos, you can ask someone else to stand as your agent on your behalf to create that chalos. Hence the shlichus in Nedarim. But he says, Nazirus, you don't create a chalos. Very strange halacha. But listen to how far the man could go. I mean, this to me is when you go out on a limb, I thought there was a limitation to how far the limb could be. And he says the following. This you'll see on the right column of page Tzadi Aleph on the last line. BiNizirus ein ze chalos shadam mechil v'yotzer ala chayfetz. Again, we would substitute instead of the word chayfetz, the gava, right? The adam. Shlochal klum. Do you hear this, Rabbi? Shalochal klum achrei kabolas Nazirus. So if I would ask you, if you're learning Masechet Nazir, is there such a thing as Chalos Nazirus? I think we would all answer with a big why. Yes, yes, yes. No, 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 no. There's no Chalos Nazirus. But rather, in Yono, what is the Indian of Nazirus? Maisa Kabbalah al Atzmo. He has to observe his Kabbalah. Shu Omer u'machlit shemakabel nihuge Nazirus. And therefore, the entire mitzvah of Parshas Nazirus is all a matter of fulfilling your Kabbalah. But lo nasakan chalos.
More in the world of Shavuos than in Nedarim.
Well, again, Shavua, you create a chalos in the Gavra, right? The Gavra is now a chefza disura. He can't have hana. But in the case of Nazirus, it's all a matter of observing and fulfilling your Kabbalah, but there's no new chalos. If there's no new chalos, I can't appoint you as my shliach. But in the case of Nedarim, where the neder is creating a new chalos, then I can appoint you as my shliach to create that chalos.
The fact that you can't, there are things you can't have hana from. I mean, you are. I mean,
But when a Nazir is enjoined from wine, it doesn't mean that the yain is a chefza disur. It doesn't mean that the gaffer of the Nazir has a chalos Nazir. All that is gone, according to Reb Shmuel. Again, he's only defending the Trumas Hadeshen. Keep in mind that the Rishonim think otherwise. But to defend the Trumas Hadeshen, he's saying that Nazirus is not a chalos. Therefore, Tosfos understood it doesn't lend itself to shlichus until Tosfos introduces the element of what? Of karbanos of the Nazir. Now, there's another section here which I'm afraid to get into because I think it'll take us an hour, but I'll just mention it in passing, and then we'll get to the main meat and potatoes for today. And you'll see a paragraph here that starts al pi on the left column, and he has here a Minchas Chinuch who says the following: that there's no Tenai neither in Hafara nor in Hakama. Why? Because we have a principle called Ein Shlichus B'Hafara. And if there's no Shlichus in Hafara, it means the father or the husband cannot send a Shliach to do the Hafara for him, and Hafara requires, let's say, a verbal declaration as opposed to Hakama, which we discussed at great length, is believed, but so when the father or the husband declares hafara, he cannot send an agent to declare hafara, and therefore there's no such thing as Tenai. And the Minchas Chinuch assumes that all the dinim of hafara apply to akama as well. And therefore there's no shlichus neither in hafara nor in akama, and there's no Tenai, therefore, neither in hafara neither in akama. But the only problem is the Gemara Nedarim Adaf Samach Tes says that there is such a thing as a Tenai in Hakama. And a man declares that Lo Tochel Hakama, I don't want my Hakama to be Chal, Elim Kain, Chala Hafara. Again, that's the sugi, if you remember, of Kol She'ena B'Zecher Ze'ena B'Masacha. But nevertheless, the Gemara doesn't question the fact that he could make such a Tenai. Exactly what will be the result of the Tenai, that's going to be the sugya. But there is such a Tenai. And Eich Moel Tenai, Hare Ein Shlichus. There's no Shlichus in Hakama. And the Baal or the father has to do the Hakama personally. Cannot appoint an agent. So how could there be a Tenai in Hakama? And if you'll see at the end of that paragraph, he leaves it with an open-ended question. Eich Moel Tenai B'Hakama, Hare Havidavar She'eno B'Shlichus. There's a beautiful footnote here, number Vav. If you want to just make a note of it, again, I just don't want to end up with, especially Yair has to leave a little early, so I wanted to get in the punchline here before he has to go. But, I would very highly recommend, if you have an extra couple of minutes, to analyze footnote number Vav here. And, he has a tremendous chiddush here in terms of how Nedarim and Nazirus operate. But now we get to the main punchline of today, and that starts here on page Tzadi Beis, if you have that. And this is going to be the Ritva in Ksubis. And I always have said this over and over again, that the closest thing in the Rishonim to Briska Lumdus is the Ritva. Not to exclude the Rambam and the Ramban or the Rashba, but there you have to work out the lumbus. The Ritva is like a Rosh Hashiva. He speaks it all out. And he says the following. The parsha of Nedarim and of Nazirus opens with the word hafla. And no neder nor Nazirus could be chal without hafla. The word hafla has a double connotation. It means, first of all, hafla's peh, meaning something that comes out of your mouth, but it also means hafla bebirur. It's got to be crystal clear. And he quotes a Gemara in the name of Rabbi Tarfon that lo nitna nazirus el hafla. Says the Ritva the following. Let's analyze the hafla. When he takes a neder, or he accepts upon himself Nazirus, he says, I'm accepting upon myself if. So the hafla now, in terms of the Kabbalah's Nazirus, is limited to the if. If X, then there's a neder. If X, there's a Nazirus. He never accepted upon himself the hafla's peh, a neder or Nazirus, if not X. And therefore, says the Ritva, I don't need to come on to the parsha of Tanoim in Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain, leave that all out. There's no hafla's peh. I'll show it to you inside. He says, Ein kabol al Tenai yichola lachul. He says what he accepted upon himself al Tenai cannot be chal, not because of the parsha of Tanoim, because harei lo piresh b'sfasav, El Masha Hisna, meaning only on this side, that X happens and not Y. But if Y happened, he never accepted upon himself hafla.
Meaning our starting off point that Tenai comes, whether a mice or not, the Tenai is coming to be mevatel. I mean, the Tenai is built in. The Tenai is the hafla itself.
Correct. Why is it hafla itself? Because he never expressed a Kabbalah on that side. Right, so he says, my Kabbalah is limited to this side. If it rains today, then I have a Kabbalah. If it snows today, I don't want a Kabbalah. So therefore, there was never a floss peh.
With Tenai, if I remember correctly, from Shir many years ago, it could either be something which is integrated into the halos, or it could be an external thing.
Right.
I took this thing, and the Tenai will determine whether this is actually a mice or not. But what we're saying here is that you haven't done anything at all. And then the Tenai is either going to make it a Maisa or not Maisa. Right. There's no.
So what I'd like to do today, Rabbosai, after quoting the Ramban as another answer to Tosfos Kasha, I want to see what we could build on this Ritva. Because honestly, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but Libi Omerli, that the Ritva is saying something very profound. And honestly, I don't even know why Tosfos is racking his brains on this kasha. He has to come up with the answer. No, the shlichus, because of the karbonos of a Nazir, and then we have to figure out, is there shlichus in Nedarim? And then we're going to set up the, with the Truvas Hadeshet, maybe there's true. I don't know. It seems to me that what the Ritva is going to do here is he's going to pull the pillow from underneath our standing, there's no kasha at all. But first, let's mention the Ramban. And the Ramban says something which needs a lot of thought. And I'll just point out again, only for those who might be interested, that on page Tzadi Daled, he's going to begin in paragraph number 4, which starts with Achen B'chidusha Granat, with an entirely different mahalach. And almost the entire balance of the next 6 pages is based on this Granat. We're not going to get up to this Granat. We'll just mention it when we get to it, but we're not going to go into it. But I believe that this Granat is predicated, without his mentioning it, on this Ramban. And the Ramban is tucked away at the end of Baba Basra. And he says the following, that there are 2 types of Tanoim. One requires, Mishpatei Tanoim, is derived from the parish of Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain. And one is a different kind of Tenai. We might use the borrowed term Tenai, but it's fundamentally different. And it doesn't require Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain. How do we differentiate between these 2 categories? There's one category called Bein Adam Lechavero, so to speak. What does that mean? Lacherim, he calls it. If I enter into a kinyan or a kiddushin or gerushin, there's always a relationship between the person who's creating this Tenai and the chalos itself. And therefore, the Torah says, if you're entering into a relationship, everything has to be written clearly. Go to a lawyer to read the fine print. Do you have mishpatei tanoim and all the regulations that we derive from Bnei Gad Bnei Reuven? But Nedarim and Nazirus belongs to a whole different category of Tenai. And that is hisnal davar she'eino beino levein acherim ela beino levein atzmo. So the Nazirus and the Nedarim are only relevant between he and himself. And again, you have to analyze that in the context of, Dvarim shebeino leveina and inui nefesh and so forth and so on. But the basic principle is intuitive, that when I take a neder, it's relevant to myself. I'm not taking a neder that's relevant to you, but to myself. And the same is true for sure for Nazirus. And he says that in that case, since it's all your initiative and it's not a relationship that's objective, that relates to other people, therefore, certainly Tenai will limit that Kabbalah's Nazirus, Kabbalah's Nedarim, even without Mishpatei Tanoim. It's all Kefir Tzon. So that's the Ramban. So just to summarize, how many different answers do we have to Tosas Kasha? Let's go over them. Number one, Tosas answered that there is Shlichus in Nazirus because of Karbanos. Number two, we have the Shita Megubetzes, that in the case of Nazirus, it's Osi Dibur, Umevatel Dibur, I don't need Mishpatei Tanoim. Then we have the answer of the Ritva, that you need haflas peh, and on the side of the Tenai, there was never haflas peh. And now we have the answer of the Ramban, that we don't need Tenai in the formal sense if it's not objective, but it's purely subjective. So far, so good. Now we have the Reb Chaim. Now, I would like to throw out a question here for the Olam to think about as we go through Reb Chaim, and that is whether this Reb Chaim is really giving us the deeper meaning of the Ritva. Again, the Reb Chaim is totally oblivious to the Ritva, but I just think conceptually, perhaps, the Reb Chaim is giving us a deeper insight into the Ritva. Perhaps. That's for you to judge. Now, Reb Chaim, as you know, wrote his Chidushim on the Rambam, but lots and lots and lots of Torah of Reb Chaim was given over from student to student, from generation to generation orally, and that's the case here. This Reb Chaim could be found in the Chidushei Agrach al Shas, but usually, we don't even look at Chidushei Agrach al Shas unless we have a good Chiddush to say, but we don't think it's so reliable. But in this case, I think the Chidushei Agrach al Shas is very reliable because both Baruch Ber, the Talmud of Reb Chaim, and the Brisker Rav both quote this Reb Chaim in their writing. So I think it's something that we should take serious. And he says the following. So does everybody have the place here? We're on Sadi Beis, and we're like major Os Beis, on the second line of this paragraph that starts with the Kisvei Agrach. He says the following. Mashamo il Tenai BiNizirus Eino midin parshas Tanoim. Okay, so that's the major breakthrough over here. Tosas, on the other hand, is going to apply the parsha of Bnei Gad Bnei Reuven and require shlichus. The other Rishonim don't require shlichus. So Reb Chaim is now going to give us a deeper insight as to why we don't require shlichus, and we don't have to match up to Mishpatei Tanoim in all its requirements and regulations. Elahudin misuyam behilchas nedarim. So we're taking nedarim out of the entire package of all chalosim which require mishpatei tanoim in order to undermine the chalos. Shaneder eino chal al atzad she'eino rotze bo v'lomdim davar zeh me'apasuk ha'adam b'shvua prat lionus k'de'isa the Gemara b'Shvuos, etc. L'gabi nidrei shkagos. So we have a sugya called nidrei shkagos. Like, for example, a person accuses his wife of a certain act of theft, and therefore he imposes a neder on her, and then he finds out that she was guiltless, and that's called nidrei shkagos. And the Gemara establishes that the reason why Nidrei Shkagos is not valid is because of a pasuk called Ha'adam, which is in the Parsha of Shvua, And Adam means prat la'onus or prat l'shogeg, and so forth and so on. Says Reb Chaim, we don't need the parsha of Tanoim to undermine a neder al Tenai if the Tenai was not fulfilled or Nazirus, because we have a special Gzeres HaKosuv, a Yalfusa, that sets up Nedarim and Nazirus in a special category of Ha'adam B'Shvua. And he's saying, when he takes a Tenai, that he doesn't want the neder to be chal without the kiyum of the Tenai. And therefore, Ha'adam B'Shvua invalidates such a neder because it's basically saying that he's a shogeg, he's an onus, he doesn't want it. This wasn't really his ratzon. So Rabosai immediately, I wrote myself an entire note here on the side. I didn't realize that the whole essay here is going to basically, but what would you say here to this Reb Chaim? What objection should we raise to Reb Chaim?
Tenai and Onsim seem to be pretty different. He's saying that when I make a Tenai and it's not isn't fulfilled, that's like Nidre Onsim.
Right, because I didn't want
Right.
the neder to be chal on that side. So that's exactly what onus and shogeg is about. But Reb Chaim says I don't have to come on to Mishpeh Tanoim B'nei Gad B'nei Reuven because Ha'adam B'Shvua, I have a separate Gzeres HaKosuv and a separate Yalfusa. But what question I think we have to ask over here?
Yeah, but if the tonight didn't happen, the neder is chal. The Mishpah is chal.
If the neder was not makuyam, if there was never a kiyum of the Tanai,
Right.
then the neder is not chal. Why? Because the neder has to be a adam
No,
with
I think-
ratzon, and he didn't have ratzon.
No, so, but if it's not was, let's say I will become a Nazir if X and Y happens. If
Right.
X and Y does happen, then
Right.
the Nazirus is.
Right, because he had full-fledged ratzon that he
That
should
wouldn't be
become.
the case if you said I'll be a Nazir, but that your Nazir was based on an assumption that's incorrect. Meaning a show, meaning something that's
Right, if I-
invalidates the whole thing.
Right.
Right.
If I had a certain assumption and that assumption was not correct, and I didn't have ratzon for my nazirus.
Correct, but here you have Ratzon for your Nazirus in a limited circumstances. As
Okay, but let's say he really doesn't want to be a nazir. He doesn't want to prohibit his wife if she's guiltless, and therefore there's no ratzon, and therefore there's no other b'shvua. I don't even need the parsha of Tenai because the Torah requires other b'shvua.
Absolutely. Well, I guess what I'm saying is this is not a case of onus. When it's not.
No, I'm saying just like we have in Ones, ratzon, here too in Tenai, it's ratzon. In formulating his Tenai, he reveals to us that he doesn't have ratzon on that side. And therefore, it's like Nidre Onsim and Nidre Shkops.
But he does have Ratzon.
No, it doesn't
No,
have.
no, no,
On one side, he has.
So now you're bifurcating it. That's, I guess, what I'm saying is in an onus situation, in that your whole statement becomes invalidated. While here it doesn't. I mean, you're bifurcating. You're saying the Re'i Ratzon is a shkaga. I would say it's not a shkaga at all. He wants the Nazirus to become effective, or the net become effective in limited circumstances.
Right,
When it
but if
doesn't
those
become-
circumstances didn't come
If
to
the
fruition,
circumstance comes- but that was his ratzon. That wasn't an onet. That was his ratzon. His ratzon was that if that circumstance doesn't happen, then I'm not taking the neder and the zeros. I would argue
That-
that it is not a situation where it's not his ratzon. It's exactly the Tenai is exactly formulating his ratzon.
but Eli, it sounds to me like you're saying davar v'fucho. You're saying not A and A at the same time. Because if you're admitting to me that on that side he doesn't want the neder, so
But
then
he does not.
he doesn't want
from
the
a-
neder.
from a side of onus. That's my point.
Again, Reb Chaim is understanding that why doesn't onus valid? Why is a neder ba'onus invalid? Because he's lacking ratzon. It's not a adam b'shvua. Adam b'shvua means you have to have ratzon, and Reb Chaim therefore wants to extend it
Why can't you
to
have
a case of
ratzon
a
for negative. But it seems like Rav Chaim is saying I can only have ratzon for a positive. Why can't you have ratzon for a negative? I have ratzon that says that if X doesn't happen, then I am not taking the shore. That's
Right.
my ratzon.
Right. So that's exactly what
That's
Reb
not a-
Chaim is saying.
That's why you're not a Nazir. That's why you're not a Nazir.
I think you're getting the word onus, that it's not like, it's not the traditional onus of some contingency or situation that you couldn't have predicted, which prevents you from doing something. He's saying that this is more like fundamental to the das of the Baal when he takes it.
So this is, I think, the objection. That's what I wrote to myself here. I don't get it. In Kol Kinyonim, a Kinyan can't be chal against a person's will. And das, forgetting about the parasha of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, das and Kinyonim is a prerequisite. There's no such thing as Gittin or Kiddushin or Kinyonim without das. So if Reb Chaim is saying that once you express yourself in a Tenai, and you're saying to us, you're revealing that you don't want it if so-and-so doesn't happen or whatever, then why do I need Mishpatei Tanoim at all? If Reb Chaim is saying, in other words, I don't understand. You have a parsha called Ha'adam V'Shvua, and Reb Chaim is justifying that because he wants to establish that if you don't have Ratzon, and you've expressed the fact through the Tenai that you don't have Ratzon, then the whole game is over and there's no ned, there's no. Why not apply the same yardstick to Dinei Momenos, to Gittin V'Kedushin, and say that the Gittin Kedushin is based on das, but he's telling us that he doesn't have das in that. So why do I need Mishpat Tanoim? Why do I need the Pasha B'nei Gad U'Bnei Reuven? Why do I have myself limited to, Isa B'Shlichus, Isa B'Tenai, less of B'Shlichus, less of B'Tenai? How does that all make sense? So I know that Yair has to leave. No, but listen, Yair, the reason why I wanted you to stay for that last minute before you run is because the entire balance of what we're going to study here is an attempt to answer this question. Why is it that in all kinyanim and Gittin Kedushin we require B'nei Gad B'nei Reuven Mishpatei Tanoim? It's not enough that he says, well, I don't want the marriage if. That's not enough. But yet in Nedarim, based on Adam B'Shvua, if he says, I don't want the neder if, that's enough to undermine the neder. Okay, so that's what we want to try to analyze in the next few minutes. And you'll see here on the left column on page Sadi Beis, Yesod Achiluk Bein Tos BiNidarim L'Tos B'Kinyan. So again, in the first paragraph, he reiterates the question. We have a special Yalfusa, the Gemara Shvuas of Adam B'Shvua, and that tells me that if he doesn't have full das and ratzon to generate the Isa Shvu Nedarim, it's not chal. And we don't even have to come on, says Reb Chaim, to the parsha of Bnei Gad U'Bnei Reuven, and therefore we're not bound by those regulations and limitations. However, in all other chaluyos, we are bound by the limitations of Bnei Gad U'Bnei Reuven and Mishpatei Tanoim. Why? Why not assume that, you know what, it's not mirtzono, it's not midaito. He explicitly mentioned what his das is and when he wants the chalos, when he doesn't. Why do we need Mishpatei Tanoim? So first he quotes Reb Shimon Shkop in the paragraph that starts B'Shara Yosher, and I'm going to read to you the third line in that paragraph. B'neder dahavi inyan chalos isur ein adam yochol lifol isurim ki im haTorah. And again, skipping a little bit, v'lo machmasha adam paul as hachalos v'chidesh as isur ela shekeinu din Torah. Rav Shimon Shkop now is machadesh a gevaldige chiddush, a major revolutionary breakthrough, and he says that the difference between kinyanim on the one hand and nedarim on the other is that in kinyanim it's the person's das that creates the chalos kinyan, whereas in nedarim the chalos iser is chal me'elav, and the Torah is creating the chalos iser. This, Yoni, is similar to what you were talking about before about bailus. That you're the bailim, you're in the driver's seat with regard to kinyanim, etc., but not with regard to nedarim. Your participation in creating the neder is only to get the words out of your mouth. But once you get the words out of your mouth, then the Torah takes over, steps in, and creates the chalos ha'isa. That's the chiddush of Reb Shimon Shkop. Okay, so my nafkamina, I don't understand. It sounds to me at this point that Reb Shimon Shkop is only exacerbating the problem. In Nedarim, there should be less of a significance of das. Das plays a secondary role. So why are we saying that you don't need Mishpatei Tanoim? Unless Reb Shimon Shkop is just justifying the Havamina, why we need the Pasuk of Adam B'Shvua. Okay, that's fine. Because if not for the Pasuk of Adam B'Shvua, I don't care about his das. I don't care about his Ratzon. the chalos is generated by the Torah itself. We just need his statement, his haflas peh. And therefore we need the chiddush of ha'adam b'shvua. But what is the chiddush of ha'adam b'shvua at the end of the day? And ha'adam b'shvua is now going to turn everything upside down, such that now he himself will determine the neder or not, and we don't even need mishpatei tanoim. But first he says nafkamina. He says the following. There is such a thing as a kinyan li'achar lamed. Is that correct? Now, what happens if you're maknis something to a person li'achar lamed, and before the 30 days pass, you decide that you want out? Can you be mevatel the kinyan? Yes. But in the Nedarim, he says, based on the Gemara and Kedushin, take efkesha omar, once he says the neder is shvua, then the Isa will be chal, again, li'achar lamed, but he eino yochel lachzer ba'afilu b'toch lamed. Now, if you're the bailam on creating the chalos, and your bailus will express itself in materializing the chalos in 30 days, clearly you should be able to be choser bo before that 30-day period, and that achen is the case with regard to kinyanim. But in shvua neder, you can't be choser bo even after lamed. Why? Because all we need is your dibur. Your dibur is chal. And again, the neder will be chal by virtue of the Torah creating the Isser when? Li'achar lamed. But in the middle, you can't be choser bo because you cannot undermine your haflas peh. I mean, again, these are radical chidushim. Ulefizeh, based on this, we might ask the opposite question. So why do we need the ratzon and the das of the noder if HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Torah is creating the chalos Isser? Why not just have his haflas peh v'gamarnu? Oh, now we have to introduce the gzeres hakasav of ha'adam b'shvua, and that's called piv v'libo shavin. So what does this give me? And now we're going to go to the other extreme after the gzeres hakasav of ha'adam b'shvua, and now paradoxically his ratzon alev is going to play an even greater role, not in terms of creating the chalos ha'isur, because again, according to Reb Shimon, you don't create the chalos ha'isur, but, and now I'm on the bottom of paragraph ulefi zeh, nimtza she'ena ratzon ba b'fnei atzmo, in order to generate the isur. Ella, what's the requirement of ratzon that's established and derived from ha'adam b'shvua kidei sheyehei ma'aseh neder? Right, the Torah is going to take your ma'aseh neder and generate a chalos isur of neder. But the Torah is jumping on what? On your ma'aseh neder. Here, the requirement of das and ratzon is in the ma'aseh neder. And if you don't have a ratzon, then your ma'aseh neder is not called a ma'aseh neder. Ubazeu cholok mikol hachaluyos on the bottom paragraph. In all other chaluyos, it's his das that creates the chalos, whether it's a kinyan or kedushin or gerushin. In neder, if we would need his das and his ratzon to create the iser, then nedarim would be exactly identical with kinyanim and kedushin. But here we don't need his das to create the iser because the Torah is going to generate the iser. But nevertheless, we derive from ha'adam b'shvua a din misuyam, that in neder and shvua, we don't have an asiyah of a ma'aseh neder without his das and without his ratzon. So there's a kind of a paradox over here. What do I mean? On the one hand, if you ask me where is das more significant and have a greater power inherent in the das, if I compare kinyonim to nedarim, what would be your answer?
Nedarim.
No, I would say fakeret, that it's in kinyanim that your das plays a greater role, because the entire chalos of the kinyan is generated by your das, together with the ma'aseh kinyan, obviously. In nedarim, who creates the chalos? The Torah creates the chalos. So therefore I'd say your das is secondary. But the paradox here is that it comes out just the opposite. That dafka in nedarim and in shvuos, your das is critical and plays an even greater role than das in kinyanim and in kedusha. And for this, I want you to take a look on page Sadi Dalid for a moment, he says the following. Again, the language here is a little bit tricky, but do you see on the third line he has the word Siba? Anybody see that? The word Siba. He has it in inverted commas. Yeah. He says the following. In the cases of kinyanim, then the das is a Siba. What does that mean, a Siba? I think he means it's a generator, if you could call it that. It generates together with the Maisa, the Chalos. So now, did he have enough das? Which, if it's like when you pump up, you go to get petrol, right? So you pump it up. Is there enough das to pump up the Maisa to create a kinyan? Obviously, yes, right? And if the Tenai would be fulfilled, then the Gerish and the Kinyanim would be Chal. So he gave enough das into the Maisa Kinyan. So now the Tziruf of A plus B, of das plus Maisa, can create a Kinyan. He can create the Chalos. So what's a Tenai? Says Reb Chaim, the Tenai is coming to create a da on the third line down from the top. Das negdis. We need a das negdis. We need another das, in the case of Bittul Tenai, to undermine, to vitiate the das that created the Kinyan. And for that, we need Mishpatei Tenai. We're not going to play games over here. We're not going to say, well, he said this, he said that. No. You have to create a new entity of das, which is a das HaMisnagedes, which has now the power, the anti-force, to undermine and destroy the das that created the Kinyan. Aval BiNizirus, the das is not called a Siba. Why? Because the das doesn't create the Chalos Isur. And I think, again, Reb Chaim here is very close to Reb Shimon. El Hinitz Nitzreches, why do we require das in Nedarim? Not to create the Chalos Neder, but Litzuras Maisa Neder. But he calls it a Machshir. Now, in general, just give me an intuitive response. What is more powerful, the Maisa itself or the Machshir? The Maisa, right? No. Says Reb Chaim, it's Pugfaker. It's the Machshir that is more critical, because the Machshir gives you the whole basis on which we create the Maisa. Any Chalos needs a Machshir. And he says in Nedarim, what's the Machshir that sets up the Maisa? Again, the Chalos is going to be inherent in the Maisa. The Torah is going to generate the Chalos Isa Neder because and by virtue of the Maisa Neder. But how do you create a Maisa Neder? That's where the Torah is Machadish Ha'odah B'Shvuah, that the Ratzon is going to create a Maisa Neder. And therefore, it's not that you need, through Tenai, a new Das to be Mavatal the other Das. The Tenai is only giving us what? The Maisa Neder. It's telling me that on this side, there is no Maisa Neder. That's the Ha'odah B'Shvuah. The Ratzon is a Tenai to create a Maisa Neder. If you don't have a Maisa Neder, then the Torah is not going to build and generate a Chalos, Iser, Hefta, and so forth and so on based on a Maisa Neder, unless there is a Maisa Neder. And now we're saying that on the side that there's no Kiyum Tenai and there's no Ratzon, then he didn't take the Maisa Neder. What does it sound like to you, Rav Osai? The Ritva, I really hold, again, maybe I'm off my rocker, that this Reb Chaim, which is very much connected to the breakthrough of Reb Shimon, although I'm not positive that Reb Chaim would accept Reb Shimon, but I think it's giving us a deeper insight into the Ritva. And he says, now again, I come from a family of Darshanim. So what I'm about to say now is kind of that side of my personality that's a Darshan. You know that the Bahag does not count the mitzvah of Anochi Hashem Elokecha in Taryag. Yeah? So there's no mitzvah of Amunah in the Taryag mitzvahs. So the Ramban tries to explain and defend the Bahag. This is my class that I give in Hagefen. And says the Ramban that Emunah of Anochi Hashem Elokecha is so fundamental that it's not counted in the Taryag. So it's very interesting. There's a paradox here. Dafka, because of the fundamental nature of Emunah, that Emunah is the basis on which all the mitzvahs are predicated. See, it's not Bichlal mitzvahs because it's so fundamental. It's the precondition, the Tenai Mukdam of mitzvahs, and therefore it's not counted in the Taryag. I'm using this as a mashal to explain Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim is saying in Nedarim, the Ratzon is a Tenai Mukdam. It's not the das that's creating the Chalos Neder, but it's the Tenai Mukdam to create a Maisa Neder. And if it's not a Maisa Neder, then the Torah is not going to build on it and generate a Chalos. Says Reb Chaim, I don't need Mishpatat Tanoim. I need Mishpatat Tanoim when the das is the Siba. If the das is the Siba, then I have to create what? A das negdis. And the Torah and the halacha, the legal books are going to define what is a das negdis that can undermine and vitiate the das that created the Maisa and therefore created the Chalos. But I don't need that in the case of Nedarim, because the Ratzon in Nedarim is so fundamental, because it generates and defines a Maisa Neder, that without the Ratzon, and that's what we derive from Adam Mishvua, there is no Maisa Neder. And if there's no Maisa Neder, I don't need to come on to Mishpat. No. I don't need to create a Das Negdis. Again, Rabbos, I feel a little bit disappointed that I didn't have another hour to go through. I don't know. I always have that issue about next week. Every shir should be what's it called? A standalone? Standalone. But this page, Tzadi Beis.
We could vote on it.
Yeah, this. Yeah.
So this
In my fantasy world, you would come to me and say, Rabbi Berzon, I'm going to put in another one. That's in my fantasy.
I made it tonight.
But I realize that if that's just the fantasy.
I made it tonight. I'm only going to come next week if we continue.
Okay. Anyway, it's a lot of beautiful stuff here. A lot of very profound stuff.
You got me hooked. I went through the whole thing while we were talking.
Oh, you went through all of Tzadi Gimel? Wow, you're fast. I mean, it took me hours to go through Tzadi Gimel.
I didn't say I understood it.
Yeah, I didn't tell you.
You didn't tell me.
Yeah, so let me just shut this off. You have a second, Howie, or you're running?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to make it as fast.